Late May 1940. The docks at Dover. A lone British officer steps onto English soil. His uniform is torn, his face a mask of exhaustion. He carries no rifle, no equipment. He looks less like a soldier from a professional army and more like a survivor pulled from a shipwreck. This is not a hero's welcome. It is the quiet, grim evidence of a military disaster on a scale no one thought possible. By all logical calculation, Britain's war should be over in a matter of weeks. This man was not an exception. He was the rule. And behind him, an entire army, broken and disarmed, was about to wash ashore. In just 9 days, Operation Dynamo would pull over 338,000 Allied soldiers from the beaches. But this was not a victory. It was the greatest salvage operation in military history. Left behind was everything needed to fight a modern war. Over 2,400 artillery guns, 65,000 vehicles, and nearly 500,000 tons of supplies. The men were home, but the British Army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. So how did a military catastrophe of this magnitude not lead to immediate political collapse? Why didn't Britain sue for peace? To understand how the nation survived, we must first go inside the secret war cabinet meetings, where the will to fight was already on the verge of breaking. The battle for Britain was not first fought in the sky or on the beaches. It was fought here, in the stuffy, smoke-filled rooms of the War Cabinet, beginning on May 26, 1940. As the army in France was disintegrating, the government in London was on the verge of its own collapse. On one side was the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax. Representing a powerful portion of the British establishment, he argued from a position of cold, hard logic. The British Expeditionary Force was doomed. France was beaten. To continue fighting was to invite the complete destruction of the country and the empire. The only sane, pragmatic path was to explore peace terms. His proposal was specific. Use the Italian dictator Mussolini as a mediator to find out what terms Hitler might offer. As the cabinet minutes record, Halifax believed that if they could get terms that didn't destroy Britain's independence, it was their duty to consider them. On the other side was the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, in office for just 16 days. He saw Halifax's logic as a fatal trap. Any negotiation from a position of near total military defeat, he argued, would be a disaster. The nation's bargaining power was zero. Hitler's terms, he predicted, would involve disarmament and the installation of a puppet government, effectively turning Britain into a German slave state. Churchill's position was recorded bluntly. Nations which went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished. For 3 agonizing days, the argument raged. This was not a united nation roaring defiance. It was a fractured government, where the common sense view was to cut a deal. Churchill was politically isolated, his own future hanging by a thread. The fate of the Western world was being debated by a handful of men, while the sound of German tank engines echoed just across the channel. But as London's leaders debated the price of survival, an unexpected and still controversial order was being given on the battlefield, one that would grant them the one thing they needed most: time. On May 24, 1940, the German war machine was poised for its final, crushing blow. The panzer divisions of Army Group A were just miles from Dunkirk, the last port of escape. Their commanders could practically see the English Channel. Then, the unthinkable happened. A direct command from Hitler arrived, the infamous Halt Order. This was not a single, inexplicable blunder. It was a decision born from a toxic mix of professional caution and political arrogance. On the ground, experienced generals like Gerd von Rundstedt feared their tanks would get bogged down in the canals and marshlands of Flanders. They wanted to preserve their precious armor for the final conquest of France, not risk it in a costly grind. But another voice had Hitler's ear. Hermann Göring, the ambitious head of the Luftwaffe, rashly promised he could annihilate the trapped army from the sky alone. For the German Air Force, it was a matter of prestige. Hitler, convinced by both arguments, agreed. The panzers stopped. This order created a 48-hour window, a fatal gap in the German onslaught. In a basement office in Dover, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay received the signal. He was to begin the most desperate naval operation in history. The operation, codenamed Dynamo, was born not of hope, but of professional despair. In his command post deep beneath Dover Castle, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay and his small staff faced an impossible equation. The port of Dunkirk, the only deep-water harbor, was being systematically demolished by German bombers. The initial Admiralty plan, dated May 26th, projected the rescue of just 45,000 men over 2 days, before the port became completely unusable. The rest of the army would be lost. But Ramsay's team spotted a desperate, fragile alternative, a long, narrow breakwater known as the Eastern Mole. It was little more than a wooden walkway, never designed to moor ships or bear the weight of an army, yet it jutted out nearly a mile into the sea, reaching water just deep enough for a destroyer. This flimsy structure would become the single most important pier in the Western world. The true workhorses of Dynamo were not the civilian boats of legend, but the sleek, gray destroyers of the Royal Navy. These ships, designed for speed and combat, became improvised troop transports. A destroyer with a crew of 200 would steam up to the precarious mole, tie off, and take on 1,000 exhausted soldiers, packing them shoulder to shoulder on every available inch of deck space. Then it was a mad dash back to England, a frantic unloading, and an immediate return to the inferno. The cost was staggering. The skies over the Channel were the hunting ground of the Luftwaffe's Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. For the sailors, their terrifying siren was the sound of impending death. On May 29th, the destroyer HMS Wakeful, loaded with over 600 soldiers, was struck by a torpedo from a German E-boat. Eyewitnesses reported she sank in just 15 seconds. There were almost no survivors. This was the brutal reality at the heart of the evacuation, a relentless industrial-scale operation run by professionals at a professional's price. On the beaches, the soldiers looked to the sky and asked the same desperate question: where is the RAF? The answer lay in a difficult, agonizing decision made by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, head of RAF Fighter Command. He was engaged in a brutal strategic calculation. Every Hurricane or Spitfire sent to patrol Dunkirk was one less he would have to defend Britain itself from the invasion he knew was coming. As he later wrote, losing the air battle over France could not be allowed to lead to losing the war from home soil. So, while the RAF was not a constant, comforting umbrella over the beaches, it was fighting a furious, high-altitude battle out over the Channel. Fighter Command flew over 2,700 sorties, disrupting Luftwaffe formations and paying a heavy price. They lost 106 aircraft and 80 pilots, a crippling blow that proved Dowding's fears were well-founded. It wasn't a total shield, but it was enough to keep the sea lanes from becoming a graveyard. That air cover would have been meaningless without one final heroic sacrifice on the ground. After the Halt Order was lifted on May 26th, German panzer and infantry divisions renewed their advance, expecting to walk into Dunkirk. They were stopped cold, not by the British, but by the 40,000 men of the French First Army. Given direct orders to form a perimeter and hold it at all costs, these soldiers fought a desperate, last-ditch battle in the towns, canals, and fields surrounding the port. Their ferocious resistance is what held the line, buying the Royal Navy the final, critical days needed to pull the army off the beaches. Most of these French soldiers would ultimately be killed or captured. From the German perspective, confidence was curdling into frustration. Hermann Göring's promise to annihilate the British Expeditionary Force from the air was failing. His pilots reported an unbelievable sight. The sea was not full of sinking wrecks, but a column of ships, stretching as far as the eye can see. On the ground, German commanders, finally unleashed, were shocked to find the Dunkirk perimeter fiercely defended. The window of opportunity, opened by their own high command, was slamming shut. A significant part of their prize was slipping away. It was in this context that the little ships played their vital, heroic role. Their primary mission was not to cross the Channel and bring soldiers all the way home. It was to act as ferries. The long, shallow beaches made it impossible for large warships to get close to shore. The civilian flotilla, yachts, fishing trawlers, Thames barges, braved the chaos, the bombs, and the wrecks to shuttle thousands of men from the sand out to the destroyers and transports waiting in deeper water. They were the crucial link in a massive, state-run military and logistical machine. By June 4th, the last ship had departed. The final tally was beyond belief: 338,226 Allied soldiers saved. It was, as Churchill told a relieved Parliament, a miracle of deliverance. But as the sun rose on June 5th, Britain awoke to a terrifying new reality. It was now an island of soldiers, but an army with almost nothing to fight with. The true crisis had only just begun. The popular image was of a nation united, the Dunkirk spirit. The military reality was terrifying. Britain was functionally disarmed. Its entire army possessed enough heavy equipment for perhaps 2 divisions. Across the country, the newly formed Home Guard, drilled with shotguns, museum pieces, and even broomsticks. But this moment of maximum vulnerability triggered two hidden strengths. Prime Minister Churchill made a radical appointment. The press baron Lord Beaverbrook became Minister of Aircraft Production. A force of nature, Beaverbrook used ruthless, unorthodox methods to smash industrial bottlenecks, and the output of Spitfire and Hurricane fighters began to surge. Simultaneously, at Bletchley Park, codebreakers were delivering their first critical intelligence from the German Enigma machine. This ultra data provided priceless, specific details of Hitler's invasion plan, Operation Sea Lion. The Germans knew they had to control the air first. In August 1940, the Luftwaffe began its assault, confident it could destroy the RAF in 4 weeks. By early September, they believed they had succeeded. On September 7th, a frustrated Hermann Göring made a critical error. Pressured by Hitler to retaliate for a British raid on Berlin, he shifted the Luftwaffe's focus from destroying the RAF's airfields to bombing London directly. To the German command, it was the final move. They believed Fighter Command was down to its last few hundred planes. A terror campaign against the capital would break civilian morale and lure the last British fighters into a final, suicidal defense. Instead, they handed their enemy the one thing he needed: time. The battered airfields and exhausted ground crews got a vital reprieve to repair and reorganize. Then came Sunday, September 15th. The Luftwaffe launched a massive daylight assault, intended to be the final knockout blow. But as hundreds of bombers crossed the coast, they were met by a perfectly coordinated machine of war. The radar stations gave the warning. The doubting system vectored fighters with lethal efficiency. The sky filled with Spitfires and Hurricanes, the very same planes that had rolled out of Beaverbrook's factories just weeks before, flown by pilots who had earned their experience over Dunkirk. The Luftwaffe had expected a ghost. They found an army. The losses were staggering, unsustainable. The myth of German air invincibility was shattered in a single afternoon. 2 days later, on September 17th, a secret order was issued from Hitler's headquarters. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. The invasion was off. We return to that lone, disarmed officer stepping onto the docks at Dover. We now understand why his story did not end in his country's surrender. The catastrophe in France, paradoxically, forced Britain to abandon a continental land war it could not win and pivot to a war it could. The survival of its trained soldiers from Dunkirk provided the human core for the army that would eventually return to Europe. But that core was now shielded by a fortress built from the nation's true strengths: the Royal Navy's control of the sea, the technological and organizational superiority of its air defense system, the explosive mobilization of its industry, and the decisive edge provided by its intelligence services. Dunkirk was not a victory. It was an act of defiance that bought the one resource Britain needed above all others: time. Time to rearm, to organize, and to transform into an island capable of fighting a total war on its own terms. In the unforgiving logic of total war, the retreat from Dunkirk should have been the final chapter. Instead, what appeared to be the greatest military defeat in British history had become the very foundation for its ultimate survival, and the first necessary step on the long road to victory.